The impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the Nigerian economy has been negative, with the economy declining by 6.1% year-on-year in the second quarter of 2020, as lockdown measures taken to stem the spread depressed economic activities across the country. With a steady reopening of Nigerian economy and the global economy and a return to business activities within and outside the country, the economy recovered from COVID-19 induced recession, experiencing a 0.11% GDP increase in the fourth quarter of 2020. In the face of daunting challenges affecting the Nigerian fragile economy, the International Monetary Fund has advised Nigeria and other emerging markets whose economies were hit by the virus to take more loans to pave the way for their quick recovery from the effects of the pandemic. According to the IMF, more than half of the emerging markets and developing economies, including Nigeria, whose per capita incomes had been converging towards those of the advanced economies over the past decade, are expected to diverge over the next few years. The IMF Council came barely days after a report by the Debt Management Office put Nigeria's total external debt at $33.34 billion as at December 31st last year. It will interest you to know that Nigeria's current debt record shows that the country owes the International Development Association $11.12 billion, Eurobonds $10.8 billion, IMF loan $3.53 billion, Exim Bank of China $3.26 billion, amongst others. With Nigeria's rising debt amid dwindling revenue, what the question begging for answer is, should the federal government consider the advice of the IMF in its quest to set the economy on a growth trajectory? Well, joining me for live from our Abuja studios to prefer answer to this question and many others is a professor and a developmental economist, public policy analyst. I can go on and on. Professor Ken Ife, thank you very much for your time. Good afternoon, Professor Ife.
Oh, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, Prof, I am worried. Our debt at the moment, with figures we have, is above 30 trillion naira and about more than $30 billion when we look at it. And the IMF is saying that we can still take more loans to aid recovery. First, how does this come to you from the likes of IMF?
Well, if IMF is encouraging Nigeria to come and borrow more, it shows that they are confident of our longer-term future of our economy. One is Nigeria has not defaulted in its payment, even though things are very, very hard for us. Two, Nigeria is a resource-rich country, the biggest economy in Africa. Then three, IMF is aware of many initiatives government is working on to change the narrative on our debt and our debt sustainability. So that gives them more confidence to offer us to come back and take more.
Prof, many also say, or research also shows and proves that this administration has borrowed more in the democratic dispensation and also faced two economic recessions. So many are saying that if IMF is saying this, we should also look back and try to manage our resources, maybe look inwards and generate funds also, maybe domestic debt.
Well, the people are entitled to their opinion, but I don't seem to agree with you on this, because there are indicators that measure the state of your economy in terms of borrowing, and those indicators tend to look at two things really: the level of your debt as a percentage of GDP, and that's a moving target at all times, and also it looks at the debt service to your government revenue. We are weak in this particular respect, but on the first one we are very strong. Our debt to GDP is only 21%. The benchmark is 40%, but there are countries like America, England, Spain that are between 80 and 100%. Japan is 223%. African countries, most of them, Nigeria is among the lowest in Africa. But the second side of the coin, which is where we have great challenge, is that the money that we set aside to repay the loan or service the loan as a proportion of our revenue is very high. It should be 40% benchmark, but it goes up to from 50 to 60 or 70 as the case may be. It moves up and down. And that's where we have the challenge. And we all know why it is the case. Because the taxable revenue as a proportion of GDP is only about 5%, 6%. And when you look at the total revenue of the state, of the government as a proportion of the GDP, is about 7-8%. So compared to our peer economies in Africa, theirs is about 18%. So you can understand when the Minister of Finance says we are going to triple our revenue, that is conscious of where we are and where we need to be. But there are many, many more things government is doing to bring more comfort to all this issue of debt sustainability. But people are not talking about them. You know that the reason for the debt is because we have to borrow to build infrastructure. The nature of the infrastructure is this. There are predictions of the economy that we will by 2030 grow to 1.64 trillion GDP, and by 2050, 6.4 trillion GDP dollar, compared to Africa, which will be 29 trillion. If we don't grow, all others will grow and Nigeria will be left behind. So investors go to countries where you have infrastructure. That's why they are able to violate the benchmark on borrowing. See some of them going up to 200%. It's because they have infrastructure. If you look at the stock of infrastructure in Nigeria, it's only about 30% to 35% of GDP, compared to South Africa that is over 80% of GDP. It tells you that we have a long way to go. But having said that, the law, Fiscal Responsibility Act, which governs this area, says that any external borrowing has to be for capital expenditure, including human capital development. So the test on external borrowing is this: to what extent does what we borrow money externally for able to pay back and able to contribute to the cash flow? If they are not contributing to the cash flow, then it's very problematic. And then we now know that there are other things government wants to spend money on, see capital expenditure, but they can use their own budget to do those if they are not economic or viable or able to contribute to the cash flow. And then you now know that they have set up an infrastructure company, PLC, with 1 trillion capitalization, which is going to market for 15 trillion naira. That will be a game changer because it's going to take away much of this infrastructure that is making federal government go borrowing abroad, and then work with those, bring more PPP, and make them more viable. So that is good news. But on the other hand, government is doing quite a lot, which it doesn't even talk about. It's looked at, you know that it's borrowing now from pension fund, is under the new act, Finance Act 2020, it has created a fund for all those unused monies lying in the bank, and then borrowing against those. Of course, it's safe. It's even safer than having them in the bank. And then it's also now looking at the whole asset, the whole dormant assets of government, and saying, look, I have to do something about this. It wants to re-engineer these assets and then make them yield and sweat them to create more liquidity, so that the narrative around our borrowing is no longer borrowing against our cash flow, which is problematic. They are now going to be seeing our assets. People can now see what Nigeria owns. Otherwise, everybody knows what Nigeria owes, but they don't know what Nigeria owns. You know, and I can give you lots of examples. Like Saudi Arabia needed $25 billion. They didn't go to IMF or World Bank. They simply went and valued Saudi Aramco, and it was well over 1.5 trillion. And they said, okay, 5%. It floated 5%, and they got the 25 billion that they needed. So we need to begin to shift in this area and unlock the liquidity in our capital assets. Although some of them are being available for privatization, but we need to do more. to change that narrative.
All right. As much as I agree with you, yes, infrastructure is key, and I think that's why we're doing a lot with China. But Prof, let me ask you, you are more exposed and understand this more than we do. Some analysts also said that China has been characterized for debt trap diplomacy, and they are saying that we should be careful where we try to partner in building infrastructure, lending to build infrastructure. That's just the way to say it.
Well, I agree with you that to some extent we have a lot of challenges around bilateral loans. Not so much with the multilateral development banks, because they have their systems and they make sure that you have the ability to repay the money that they are advancing to you. They have monitoring, stringent monitoring and evaluation framework and all of that. But you cannot say that for the bilateral loans. And to the point that some people are even accusing China of having clauses in the contract that could amount to a waiver of sovereign immunity. So all of those are possible. But the thing is, we still need to borrow some of these monies. They offer it to us at concessionary rates. I mean, from 0 to 2% or 2.5%. It's very low rates. How much are we borrowing from our Nigerian banks? It's over 25% or more. So, but the test of it is how economic are those investments where you are borrowing this money for? How much can they contribute to the cash flow? And how sustainable are those debts? And then what else is government doing to increase their ability to repay and service these loans? Those are the key questions that we have to address, and I've tried to tell you what government is doing, and I'm sure they will do more.
Okay, Prof, what about state governments? At the moment, they face historic liquidity challenges, and the central bank is also willing to even withdraw support to some states. A handful of them can barely pay the 30,000 minimum wage. What do you see as we move on in the year, Prof?
Well, the subnational entities present an even greater challenge when it comes to debt and debt management. Because don't forget that debt is on the exclusive legislative list. So they ought to work with federal government when they begin to incur all those debt and get tacit approval. And that's why they are also not excluded. They are not exempt from the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Not many of them have adopted it. It's only about 15 of them. All of them ought to adopt this, because this guides fiscal transparency, accountability, and prudence in public finance management. And the earlier they do that, the better. And I do hope that the new amendment should make it mandatory for all of us to be on the same page on Fiscal Responsibility Act. And having said that, the issue of salary payment and minimum wage is a big challenge for the states, to be honest with you. And that's why the states need to get together and start thinking, formulating their plans. Some should be at the regional level, some could be on bilateral level between states, so that they can get more private sector engaged in some of the economic activity. I happen to be chairing the Technical Committee on Privatization and Commercialization in Enugu State. And I'm going around looking for private investors to partner with government on the 18 businesses that they have to ensure that we can get them back into life again. Now, you need to see more states doing this. And there are some projects that are not easy for one state to manage. In that case, like dam or something, they can work together. And there are areas that we have over 250 dams in the country, and they are not being utilized. We should use that for fishery and build infrastructure to use them for fishery. We could use them for water supply. We should use them for irrigation. But there are many, 90% are not being used. And these are strategic assets of states and federal governments.
Well, Prof, another thing that came to my mind while you were speaking is back to the pandemic. many say that the effect of this pandemic is more than what we see, that we could even have scars that can further exacerbate what we face at the moment. What do you see? Vaccines are out, and we still have some fresh cases in places like India and all of that. What's your overview? Let's do a global review now of what we see and how this will also affect our growth one way or the other with Africa's most populous nation.
Well, I think that Nigeria has done exceedingly well in tackling the COVID-19, because our approach has been massive quantitative fiscal and monetary policy intervention. And on the monetary side, you have 3.5 trillion on the table. On the fiscal side, you had 2.3 trillion sustainability, and government was furiously attacking this, and that was why we had a sharp V curve, and we only lasted 1 quarter, and we jumped out of it. And even the IMF is predicting that our growth will be 2.5% by the end of the year. Many countries are still deep-necked in the recession, but Nigeria is steaming ahead, and don't forget that we are a nation at war, and we have so much resources tied to persecuting the war in the 6 geopolitical zones, and the impact on agriculture has been phenomenal. That's why we are unable to arrest inflation that is spiraling out of control because of the food. Obviously the food sub-basket index is over 22%. So it's so difficult for a country like Nigeria to do what it has been doing. But I can understand why people are so impatient, because they do want more to be done. And of course, there are gaps and leakages in the system that need to be plugged. But when you consider that as a nation at war, we are not imposing a huge war tax like 30 to 40%. We are not borrowing $100 billion externally to go and fight the war. We are still managing, and we are even spending 500 billion every year on social intervention fund, trying to ensure that the weakest in the community are not left on their own devices. So, I really cannot understand how the government finds the money that we are spending, but it is very, very tough out there.
Let's wrap up on this note, Prof. When we finally get all of these monies, because one way or the other, we must borrow. Spending on priority must be prioritized. Health, education, and transfer to the poor. But many are saying that, yes, we have some of this already in Nigeria. What would you say about the impact of all of this cash transfers, trying to get, monies to people, the poor people, which is what IMF is also saying at the moment? Because if you look at the figures, they're saying about 90 million people will fall below poverty line as we move on in the year. So how would you assess all of this vis-a-vis what we have on ground?
Look, it would have been worse. It really would have been worse. You are talking about 90 million. If what is done over the last 6 years was not done, it probably would have been 150 million or 120 million that would have been below poverty line. And it's difficult to explain to people how much money this country makes, how much of it is wasted, and then you tell the poorest of the poor to keep praying. Pray for how long? How long are they going to remain? And then you have seen the repercussion that many of them are now more vulnerable to be recruited by the insurgents, by the terrorists, by all the bandits. So they are being recruited. So we have to do something for the poorest in the community. In other words, when you look at economic development strategy, you follow a 2-lane traffic. You invest on high return and high growth area. You also invest on the slow lane where you have disadvantages to correct disadvantage and bring people to speed. So it's a two-way traffic. So otherwise, the disadvantage will never allow the rich people to sleep with their eyes closed. And you're sowing seeds for discord and political upheaval and violence.
It's a good way to leave it. Prof, if you can do this in 1 minute, insecurity, you touched on it. In 1 minute, how do you see this affecting our projections?
Well, food security is everything. Is everything. That's what is stopping investors investing in Nigeria. Is stopping domestic investors in expanding facility. Is stopping people from even coming into the country in the first place, let alone invest. That is the biggest challenge that we face. Everything takes a backseat, and we need to tackle this more creatively and more quantitatively.
All right, it's a good way to live it. Development economist, a professor, and public policy analyst. Professor Kenny Faith, thank you very much. I appreciate this. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. And you too. Thank you.